The purpose of the video is to try and illustrate the connections that exist between Evangelion and fairy tales in general, especially with the most recent news of the English subtitle of the final movie being Thrice Upon a Time, as in a direct reference to the way fairy tales usually begin, except with thrice instead of once, and to try and show both the links between the previous Evangelion movies that we've seen in the rebuild before this one and fairy tales, and also try and predict or determine the way in which, in a simple sense of course, nothing overly precise, this last movie could have to do with fairy tales. So I think we should get started with the various fairy tale references. I'll try to be brief, go through them in an inverted chronological order, so starting with the latest to go back to the first one. So the first thing, I believe, is, of course, the title, Thrice Upon a Time. For the first three movies, we've had titles that followed a similar pattern of putting the not in parentheses. You are not alone, you cannot advance, and you cannot redo. This latest seems to break that particular pattern and go for just Thrice Upon a Time. One thing that I think is important is to remember that the title of the movie, the actual title, not the subtitle, is Evangelion 3+1. Point being, they avoid using the number 4 because the number 4 is generally perceived as an unlucky number in Japan due to it being pronounced like death. But let's assume that the reason why they said 3+1 isn't simply due to superstition, but is instead determined by other reasons. Like, for example, the idea that the 1 is a reference to a new beginning, whereas the 3 is supposed to kind of bring the story to an end. The 1 is supposed to be a callback to the first movie. So a new beginning, one could argue, and in that case there is a strong link to the fact that Once Upon a Time is generally the way in which a fairy tale begins. So to have the last movie in the rebuild actually have a subtitle that would be probably better fit for the first movie in the series is a bit worrying from a certain perspective, in that it may suggest that the movie will end with things beginning again, or that at some point in the movie there will be one reset of some kind that will put things back where they were before, or simply will start things anew. Personally, I'm not particularly happy about the idea, but also there is to consider the fact that it would be the third time that the story begins. Because if we take into consideration the original series, that's the first Once Upon a Time. Twice Upon a Time if we include the beginning of the rebuild. Thrice Upon a Time if indeed it's going to begin again for the third time. I think that's enough when it comes to this particular subtitle. I don't really have much else to say. I don't want to get too into detail when it comes to predicting how it's going to begin again, if it is going to begin again. Let's look to the third movie instead. The first thing that comes to mind here is the way Asuka is referred to during the movie by Mari, with the nickname Princess. You could just take it as a bit of an ironic way, maybe an affectionate way that Mari has to refer to Asuka. But I believe that once you reach the later stages of the story, where Mari is trying to save Shinji after the entire incident and the impact is started again, Kaworu dies, Mari is trying to forcefully eject Shinji's entry plug and save him. She tells him, while showing awareness of his state of mind not being the greatest, to go help the princess at least. Now Asuka had in the meantime, of course, been left stranded in the desert. It's not even clear if Mari is aware of it. Like, obviously she has to be, but it's not really clear when she got the news. I don't remember, at least, there being a conversation between her and Asuka. But it seems like a very strange thing for her to tell Shinji to go help Asuka when she knows that Shinji is in fact in a pretty tough place mentally. That he hasn't really been around for 15 years, that Asuka is considerably more experienced and more capable, and it's kind of weird, like, why would he be of any help to her? I guess you can just take it as go help each other out. Sure. But there is also the fact that Mari does not tell Shinji to go help Asuka. She tells him to help the princess. she uses the nickname that Shinji has never really heard before. So at that point, the line becomes truly strange in the sense that it seems like it has been positioned in that particular point in time in the narrative, not because it makes that much sense, but because it's supposed to hint at something else. It is when I heard this particular line that I actually gave some thought to the usage of the term princess, as it strongly connects Asuka being a princess with the idea of being saved or helped, and in that sense it suggested to me at least a link to fairy tales. Before this point in time, I had never even realized that there were references to fairy tales. This was when I got it. I got the idea, and I started thinking of Asuka as a princess in the fairy tale sense, if it makes any sense. So fairy tales typically have a prince saving a princess, and that's the idea. It is also true that Shinji's own purpose in Evangelion can be summarized, maybe I'll say more about it later, as saving Asuka. I mean, that is what he has to do. That is what he has failed to do in the original series. And I would assume this is what he is going to have to do in the final movie. This isn't to undermine Asuka's relevance or capability, mind you. It is just something that Shinji needs to succeed at in order to bring his journey to an end. This is what I believe to be the case. And when I thought of Asuka as a princess, I of course associated her with Western princesses, from fairy tales of course. And more specifically, I think the first one that comes to mind, I believe this is the case for many people, if they had to pick one, would be the Sleeping Beauty, Princess Aurora, depending on the version of the tale, because of what happens to Asuka when she's asleep. In the original series, as we know, Asuka finds herself in a couple of predicaments, I guess, connected to being asleep while next to Shinji. The first one, is very closely resembles the actual fairy tale in its most typical version, when Shinji tries to kiss her and she's asleep in episode 9. The second one happens at the end of Evangelion. Truth of the matter is that it is also quite linked with some of the versions of the fairy tale. Of course, I'm referencing the scene at the end of Evangelion when Shinji masturbates right next to Asuka. So that's already two instances that are a little bit questionable, but I do link Shinji strongly, and Asuka, of course, to that particular fairy tale, without there having been any direct reference to the Sleeping Beauty or to fairy tales that I know of in the original Evangelion series. So this is a sort of a weirdly retroactive thing where scenes from the original series actually gain a deeper meaning based on what happens in the rebuild. So that's one thing that should be noted. It was just my interpretation, but later on I will illustrate how this actually makes even more sense than it seems to initially. Other elements that still belong to the third movie and can be counted as references to fairy tales. Well, you'd have the curse of the Eva, as Asuka says, that she has been cursed. In truth, all pilots supposedly are cursed, but there's the fact that Kaworu is already different. So curse or no curse, it doesn't really matter. Shinji, we don't even know if he is actually cursed, because he hasn't really been around for the last 15 years. Rei is Rei, she's a clone already, so what applies to Kaworu kind of applies to Rei too. So you have Mari and Asuka, and supposedly Mari was already considerably older. I think this is generally an accepted idea, that Mari was already older than she looked in the second rebuild movie. So the only person who has been actually affected by the curse of not aging supposedly, and potentially other things, is actually Asuka. But the curse is, generally speaking, a typical narrative trope of fairy tales. It is in fact one of the main elements of the Sleeping Beauty. The Sleeping Beauty, Aurora, falls asleep through the curse of the evil fairy who enchants a needle and promises that on her whatever birthday that may have been, she will prickle her finger on the needle and fall asleep. And I believe that the other fairies tried to counter the curse by making it so that the kiss of the true love, whatever the fuck, is going to wake her up, whatever. And then when she eventually actually does end up getting her finger prickled and fall asleep, all the other fairies put everybody else to sleep also, so that the castle retains the conditions that it had when the fact happened. So it remains suspended, frozen in time for a certain amount of years. Eventually, when the spell is broken, the curse is lifted and everybody comes back to normal. But it has been a very long time, and yet nothing has changed for them. I think it's clear why there is a very strong component here that resembles what happens with Asuka. When she gets cursed, until the point in time that we reach in the third Rebuild movie, 15 years have passed. But, well, she has changed, but she hasn't actually aged. And kind of the same applies to Shinji, who, I guess, he was in a sense asleep for 15 years. So there is a connection there too. What else? Well, there is a brief thing to mention, that being Kaworu referring to Gendo as the king of the Lilin, more specifically. And this really doesn't serve much of a purpose, if not that it introduces the idea that Gendo is a king. King is also a major player, generally, in fairy tales. But by extension, it makes Shinji a prince, so that Shinji fits even more comfortably in the role of the prince of this fairy tale. Let's move back a little bit into the second Rebuild movie. What we have to mention here is the fact that Kaworu does in fact refer to Gendo as father this time, which would be weird in a sense. If he was indeed the father, then that would kind of make Kaworu again the son. But it is not incompatible with him referring to him as king, because if Kaworu is the son to a king, then that just makes him a prince also. And this is very useful because we have then what is probably the most let's say, plot significant up until this point connection to a fairy tale. And it comes in the form of a book that Rei is reading in the second movie. The only thing that I remember seeing about it is a promotional image with Shinji, Rei, and Asuka asleep under a tree, where Shinji is, I believe, listening to his music. Asuka is reading a German cooking book, and Rei is actually reading this particular book, which is The Happy Prince and Other Stories by Oscar Wilde. Now, the other stories do not matter quite as much. There is one about a giant that is kind of interesting, but the one that is more important, that is the most important, is the one about the Happy Prince. Now, the story of the Happy Prince resembles very closely the journey that Shinji experiences in the later stages of the second movie, all the way until the end of the third movie. Now, I'll try to sort of summarize what happens in it and draw the various comparisons. It should also be noted that The Happy Prince is the title, but the protagonist is actually not the Happy Prince, but a swallow, so a bird. So in the context of this comparison, Shinji would not be a prince. He would be a bird, a swallow. This is the story of a swallow that is flying around with his friends, also birds, until he comes across a reed. He falls in love with this reed, but he quickly realizes that, let's put it this way, they are too different. It's not going to work between them. The problem is that by the time that he realizes this, he finds himself alone, as all his friends are gone. They've flown away. This is, of course, reminiscent of the way in which Shinji loses all his friends, Misato, Asuka, and everybody else, because he develops an excessive attachment towards Rei. Rei not quite being the same as Shinji is something that Rei herself had tried, I believe, to convey to him during their conversation at the aquarium, during the second movie, I mean. So it's more than likely because through reading this book, Rei had identified herself as being the reed in the story, which is true. That's who she is. So eventually Shinji tries to save Rei, we know it, he refuses to go back, he wants to stay with her. Eventually he is forced to get back, but it's been 15 years, all his friends are there, but they are gone in a figurative sense. They're not the same as before. So that's that, right? This is the first similarity between the two tales. Then the Happy Prince continues with the swallow flying around kind of aimlessly until he comes across a village, I guess a town, and in this town there is a statue. This is the statue of the Happy Prince from the title. Now this is a statue that can talk, and so the swallow finds the statue, befriends the statue, and together they even make an effort to better the conditions of this town. It is quite poor, there's a lot of misery in it. In Evangelion, what we have is Shinji sort of finding himself alone, eventually wanders into Kaworu. They become friends, and they make an effort, both of them, to fix the world, to make it a better place. There is even a particular, let's call it a scene in the tale, even though it's not really a scene, where the Happy Prince invites the swallow to fly around the town and report to him about the ugliness that he finds. And of course, this is very, very reminiscent of the scene in which Kaworu accompanies Shinji outside to show him the state of the world. Anyway, the story ends with the swallow dying first, then also somehow the statue ends up dying, and they really didn't do much to make the world a better place. Let's put it this way. Good effort, but And it's kind of the same thing that happens with Kaworu and Shinji. They both fail. And remember, it is indeed true that only Kaworu dies, who is the Happy Prince. But the truth is that he dies in Shinji's place. He takes upon himself Shinji's death when he takes the collar from him. And instead of throwing it away, he puts it on himself. He probably knew that there was a possibility that things could go wrong, and he didn't want Shinji to pay for it. So these are very, very strong similarities. They cannot be just discarded as coincidences or whatever. But it lets us know that we can use fairy tales, or the fairy tales that are referenced in Evangelion, as a tool to predict or determine what could happen in the future of the story. Briefly worth mentioning is a comment that Kaji makes during the second movie still, where he references feeling like the protagonist of a Japanese fairy tale, more specifically Urashima Taro, if that is how he is pronounced. The story in question is the story of a fisherman, Taro, who saves a small turtle from the abuse of a group of children and then releases it into the sea. Now, as it turns out, the turtle in question was the princess of an underwater kingdom, palace, whatever. Point being that Taro gets rewarded by being invited over to the palace, where he spends what he perceives to be a few days with the princess. But then he asks to be allowed to return to his village. And the princess agrees on it, but under the condition that he carries with him a box, never to open it. And as he agrees, Taro returns to his village and realizes that since the time he left, it hadn't been just a few days, but it had been around 100 years. At which point he panics, opens the box, and he suddenly ages pretty much 100 years instantly. And that's the end of the story. Kaji here feels like he is in a completely different place. He doesn't seem to find Japan, or at least Nerve, to be recognizable despite having been gone for a short time. Of course, Kaji didn't really leave for 100 years. He actually was gone for a short time. But still, you get the idea. The adventure of Taro is actually reminiscent of Shinji's own transition from the second to the third movie. So as a further indication that in the second movie they had already decided to go for this particular twist of a 15-year time skip, we even have this particular comment. Of course, Shinji feels like he's only been gone for a very short time, but when he eventually is brought back, he is forced to realize that it has actually been 15 years. And this is it, I believe, for the second movie. Now, the first movie has one reference that connects all the way back, or forward, depending on how you look at it, to Asuka being the princess of the fairy tale in the third movie. So there's no Asuka in the first movie, of course, but there is a shield that Rei employs against Ramiel, that is the last angel, the one, the weird crystal angel, and she uses it to defend Shinji from the laser beam. The shield has a name, the Enchanted Shield of Virtue. The Enchanted Shield of Virtue is the name of the shield that is used by Prince Philip of the Sleeping Beauty in a Disney version of the tale to defend himself from Maleficent's breath. He also carries a sword, the Sword of Truth, and the Shield of Virtue. So here we have this sort of weird reference to the Sleeping Beauty in the first movie of the rebuild, and eventually in the third, Asuka being nicknamed Princess by Mari, with all her connections to the Sleeping Beauty in her past history throughout the series. I think this is it as far as fairy tale references are concerned. In the next video, I will speculate as to how Asuka's princess status, let's put it this way, in the rebuild could affect not just her future in the story, but overall the ending of Evangelion.